Hi, Julie Usher back, Recipes for a Sweet Life. In this video, we're going to be doing part 2 of my Mosaic cookie box. In the first part, I showed how to do this contoured cookie base, piece it together, and put all the appliques on top. And this is really just an extension of that video. It's purely optional, only if you want to add this really fancy lid on top. So let's talk about how to do that. Again, my design inspiration in large part came from these Francis Green Mosaic boxes that I found online. I really liked this sort of knobby, elevated little topper. So we're going to recreate that using a daisy cutter and a couple of other cookies as lifts. You will basically need, for just the lid, a contoured cookie piece. The box I did earlier is about 4 inches across, so I liked the lid to be about 4¼ inches, so it isn't necessarily flush with the sides, but rather extends over the sides a little bit. So you'll need a contoured piece like this, and I'm going to talk in a little bit about how to make that and dip that. 1 or 2 little round, these are about 1-inch cookies as lifts. A daisy or other shaped cookie for the knob. I think I'm going to use a daisy. That one's already iced. With an embossed cookie on top to create kind of a gem on top. So this is basically a 5-cookie project. I have a whole video on contouring cookie dough, and this is very similar to what I talk about there, though I did more of a hemisphere shape there. Here I used, as I said, a 4 to 4½ inch pan. You could use a cake pan, but this happened to be a better size than my 4-inch cake pans, a little bit bigger. And I cut a 6-inch, rolled out my dough, cut a 6-inch round, and draped it over the top. At this point, you don't need to worry so much if the edges are uneven. I do trim them up a little bit. But when it bakes in the oven, it's going to expand some. You can see this one was cut about the same length and it expanded some. So it's going to become even more irregular as it bakes. Little cracks like this are also not a big deal. They'll get covered when we actually dip the cookie, but you can try to smooth them out if you want, a little bit with your hand and maybe a little bit of flour before it goes in the oven. Then I set it in the oven, 375, its normal baking temperature, for about 10 minutes. Let it cool just until you can handle the pan. It still should be slightly warm. Twist it and it'll pop right off the top. So let's talk next about how we get this nice color on it, because you'll see my lid that I'm going to be working with is this beautiful smooth blue, and that's just royal icing. You can cover it with fondant, which is a heck of a lot easier, but I like the texture of royal icing better than fondant. So for full coverage of something, I tend to prefer to dip. And I'm going to do this. It's a bit of a messy process. So to dip, I'm getting another little board in front of me here so I don't get my workstation really, really messy, because a lot will drain off. You can also do this over a cookie sheet and a drain rack so it drains through, however you want to do it. You can pipe the icing over this using just the coupler on a big pastry bag. That makes it somewhat neater, but still you end up getting a lot of icing on your hands anyway, so I tend to prefer the dipping process. So for dipping, I've got my icing at dipping consistency. I'm looking for it to flow relatively quickly, not run straight off, but flow steadily off the spoon. I want it just thick enough that when it drains off the cookie I'm dipping, it doesn't drain so much that you see through it. It leaves a nice thick coat, but I don't want it so thick that it leaves tracks. Now I mixed this icing yesterday and I let it sit, so hopefully it'll be a little more bubble free than if you were to use it right away. If you stir it right away and mix in the water to loosen it, it can sometimes be kind of bubbly. But the process of dipping does introduce more air bubbles than if you were just piping in general. So I'm going to get my trussing needle handy and have that ready to pop air bubbles. I actually literally submerged the whole thing. So you want the icing deep enough so that you can do this without the cookie touching the bottom of the bowl. And then I'll turn it towards me. And then shake, 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 shake. I got a lot of icing on here till all the extra flows off. Shaking over the bowl. And as I do that, big bubbles tend to emerge. This is typical. And I will pop them with the trussing needle at this point. You want to get it while the icing's still wet, or you'll leave a dent in the icing. Continue to shake. So even though the icing sat, I ended up with some pretty significant air bubbles, but I think I can get most of them out. One here. And at this point, I think it looks pretty good. I don't want to handle it too much. If there are small air bubbles, it's not a huge deal because a lot of them will get covered in the decorating process. And then I set it on something elevated so that it can freely drain. Give it a minute or less, and let it drain a little bit. You'll see that as it drains off, I'd like to kind of take off as much extra as I can. The extra that drips off will eventually dry there, and it just means that you'll have more to kind of sand down and clean up later, because we're going to want a really straight edge at the bottom. I've cleaned up from dipping, and I've set the one that I just dipped aside. In order to handle that, ideally I'd let that dry overnight, like a good 8 hours, so the icing's dry all the way through, because the next step requires handling it to some extent. Here's a piece that I dipped yesterday, and you'll see how nice and smooth it is. A few tiny air bubbles, but again, those are going to be hardly recognizable once we get this decorated. And if I have cleaned up the edge pretty well by scraping off the overflow icing, I'll start with a pretty neat edge, but you'll see even so it's not, it's not completely flat. And if I were to use this as the lid on my box, if I were to set that on here, you'd see it just wouldn't sit rather evenly. And I want a really straight edge like the one up at the top. So to achieve that, I actually file that down. And if you are using this for eating purposes, then I recommend a broad flat grater. Food safe item for grating the bottom, filing it down. And I like to hold the top with a little bit of paper towel so I don't leave fingerprints on it. And just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until this is completely sanded down. And you'll have to, because this isn't as big as the piece, you're going to have to rotate the piece, of course, as well. If you are using it for display purposes, which I sometimes do, then you can also use a piece of sanding paper. This is not food grade and nothing I would recommend on something you're going to be eating. But this is a bigger piece, so the process is obviously a little bit faster. And I just use a gentle rotating motion to sand. And you'll just want to continue in that vein until you get it nice and level all the way around, until it sits nice and flush on the box. I've done that for the piece that we're going to be working on today. Before you start decorating your piece, of course, you want to dust off any extra sanding, cookie sand from the sanding process, and clean up your area. And I'm going to just move on over a lid that I started already. Again, this is a piecework process, a mosaic process. It's relatively time consuming. I'm just going to show you kind of an example of how I got this started, and you can take it from there. And I'm just going to do a small portion of the lid, whereas I put mosaic all the way around the bottom. I'm going to keep the lid relatively simple so there's some nice broad blue space showing. I just think it leads to a slightly cleaner design. So just to see, my sanding left this box very, very straight along the bottom edge. I just carried that process through a little bit longer to get a clean edge. And I started to already create the front part of the box by creating the sweep of appliqué up the front. As with part one, we'll be working with a few different types of appliqué on the top of the box. We'll be working with broad stamped fondant appliqués like this one and the centerpiece. We'll be working with two-dimensional royal icing appliqués and maybe a little bit of beadwork. What I want to do is connect this bottom sweep up with the top. So to do that, I'm going to pull out a piece of fondant, stamped fondant, that I did beforehand. And if you want to see how I did this, refer to part one of the video, because I actually roll out this piece, stamp it, and do all of that in that video as well. So I don't think we need to repeat it here. So I've got a much bigger piece than I want. Basically what I want is a length that connects right there and just connects all the way to the top. And so let me get out my ruler to kind of roughly gauge. The bottom piece here was about 2 inches. So I need this at the bottom to span about 2 inches, and I want the pattern going all the way down. So I'm going to cut it. I'm going to cut it along the lace, straight. You can use a paring knife, in there, or a pizza wheel. I'm using a pizza wheel there. And it's a little wider than I need it, but I want more white showing here, so I want these two pieces to connect. So I'm going to trim it right about there. And you can mark with your finger, you can mark with your trussing needle as a rough cutting point. I'm going to use the edge of a round cutter to create a nice shape. Is that matched up? It's still a little wide. It's going to come in a little bit more. And I don't like how much that's bowing out, so I'm going to cut that in a little bit on that side, so it's a little more gradual curve. For this, I think I'll use my pastry wheel. I want to preserve that dimension at the end, so I'm not cutting in on the bottom at all. Handling mostly from the top, so I don't get fingerprints in the area that's going to remain on the cookie. I think that's pretty good. I'll cut off all the extra when I get it situated on the box. For this part, I am going to decorate with a lid up on the cookie, just get it started partially attached, just so I make sure it's in place. And then I'll take the lid off and complete the rest off the bottom of the box, because it's a little dangerous to decorate on top of the box here, as it might slide off. So to apply fondant appliqué, as opposed to some of the big chunkier royal icing appliqués, I like to work with corn syrup as my glue, because it has less, it won't impart any kind of lumpiness to the backside of the fondant, and we want this to lie really, really flat. So I've got a little bit of corn syrup here. I'm just putting some dabs on, enough to make it tacky. And mostly at the bottom, because I'm going to be cutting off the top part, and if that top part should flop on the box as I'm putting it up, I don't want it to leave a blob of corn syrup. So again, handling from the top, I'm going to try to situate it exactly where I want it, flush with the bottom. I think that's pretty good. If there's any unevenness, which there might be, I can trim that later. Work it all the way to the top. And I'm just kind of pulling, my fondant's still a little pliable, which is good, because I'm kind of pulling this so that it meets the round circle on the top. Okay, and at this point, I'm handling the stamped area kind of gingerly, because I noticed that it's still a little wet, and I don't want to smudge it. So I'm just gently tapping it down. And I'm going to take my pastry wheel, my pizza wheel, and just cut a nice round shape around the top. And to do this, I am going to take it off this so I don't apply pressure and potentially break the bottom of the box. And I'm going to proceed with all further decorating off this bottom of the box. So just a gentle, not really pushing down super hard because I don't want to crack my box. Just a gentle cut around the round part. And I want this piece to kind of tuck up against it more fully. So I'm going to try to move that while it's still pliable. Now I want to add a ring of, I'm just again mimicking a box up here where I have a ring of oval royal icing transfers going all the way around the center ring. And then I'm flanking each of these fondant appliques with a whole row of black round royal icing transfers so that it connects with the design that I've got on the bottom. But while the fondant is still wet, I want to start getting the oval ones down, because if I let that dry, it'll be really hard for them to stick down to the level that they are on this side over here. So I'm going to complete this ring first, and then we'll work down the sides with the other transfers. I have a whole video on how to make royal icing transfers, so check that out. These are basically just in working with oval ones and small round ones on this box. Now that they're dry, I'm going to start sticking them down with my thick royal icing glue, and I have the consistency adjustments also on my website. You'll see the link to it below, and I'm just going to place these down one by one. So you can make this design as complicated as you want. If you were to mosaic the whole top, it'd take you a while because you'd be filling it out with hundreds of pieces. This lid only has about 100 small pieces on it, or that one has about 100, I should say. This one's going to have slightly fewer, whereas my bottom has about 200 to 300. And it's a gluing process. Once they dry and pop off the acetate, I can handle them separately. And the reason I like to do that is I have a lot of liberty in terms of where I put them. I can move them around, shift them around. Whereas if I were to pipe directly on the box, I'd have less ability to do that. But it is a project that requires some patience and a really special item to be giving as a gift, centerpiece type of thing. So I didn't start by putting the ovals here. I just wanted to make sure I was able to nicely connect this line first. So I'm working from what I already started on over to the wet fondant. Okay, I'm coming up to the fondant, and this is why I like it to be still somewhat soft, is because I can press these beads into it a little bit and get them closer to the same level as the ones that don't have the fondant near it. I could alternatively cut some of that fondant back, but I think because it's soft, I can just press into it and it'll look pretty uniform. As I'm picking these up, I'm also trying to choose ones that are, closer to the same size. There's some natural variability, even though these transfers were made by tracing a shape. There's some natural variability that occurs even in that process. So I'm choosing ones that I think are more closely sized and putting them side by side. So I finished up the little ring of ovals around the center, and went ahead and elevated this and started to work on the black transfers that would flank the fondant appliqué along the side. I elevated this just because it helps when I'm working on the side of something to have it more eye level. So I'm just going to basically show you how I did this process on the sides by completing this last side. What I want to reinforce by doing all of this is you needn't stick with necessarily the exact design I do. What's most important is to really understand the techniques, because then you can begin to really design and extrapolate and create fun, new, original things of your own. And I rarely like to do things twice, so this lid's going to look different than that lid because otherwise I'd get bored. So just a teeny little dot of icing is really all you need to keep these down. And then I stick my bead on. Some people might work with tweezers for this. I find them more cumbersome. So first I plant my bead of icing, then I plant my transfer, and if any icing sticks out, which it doesn't in that case, I'll take my trussing needle and clean it up. Okay, I'm down to the bottom, and there are a couple strategies. It's not really filling really nicely. That bead's pretty small, and I've got a gap. I'm going to see if I have a slightly bigger bead that just might fill it better, and then we could leave it at that. My bigger bead there looks pretty good. So I might just space these slightly differently and leave it like so. I did want to point out, though, that here I didn't get a great fit, and so what I ended up doing was I ended up sanding down one bead, and you can do this on a grater as well or on a piece of sanding paper if you're not eating it. And just hold the bead from the top edge and then just run it side by side across the paper, and that flattens one side, and then I end up with a smaller piece that I can tuck in that fits flush with the edge of the box. So for the dot work, I'm using royal icing of beadwork consistency, and I've moved this off the stand for the time being because I'm going to be piping the dots on the top of the box, and it's easier for me to do that looking down. I'll probably end up elevating it again. And I just want a little dots kind of around the periphery here. Piping as perpendicular to the surface as possible. I'm steadying the tip of the bag with this forefinger of my left hand. I'm not squeezing with that. That's just keeping my hand from shaking because it's doing a little bit of that today. As I said, there are just myriad ways you could design these boxes. And I'm just going to do a little bit of dot work down the edge. Remember, we did that on the other box, so I want to make sure they connect. I'm also trying to get the size of the dots about the same, so it looks like they're piped continuously. And with black, it's important. I'm going more slowly than usual because if I make a mistake, it's just pretty hard to correct. And now I just want to put the knob on. The knob is comprised of 4 pieces. I started with 2 1-inch rounds. These are going to become the little riser. I may not need both of them. We'll see how it looks. But I actually sprayed them because I wanted this to look more silver in case it's viewed from the side. I don't want to see the brown dough. So I sprayed these with a silver luster spray. I did that in my part 1 video. I sprayed the sides and the bases. So refer to that if you have questions. I use PME luster spray for that, though there are other brands that work well. So we'll need those risers. Then my daisy piece, I think I'm going to do a pink lid. The white might look nice too. We're going to go with the pink. And then I've got an embossed cookie doodad that started with this embossed piece. It was embossed, baked in a silicone baking mold, popped out, and then sprayed with that same PME spray to create that gem shape. I'll show you how I do this in an upcoming video. I've then taken that piece and jazzed it up with white royal icing transfers around the outside, a turquoise colored one in the middle, and black little beadwork. And I'm just going to be gluing these. This is kind of a sandwiching process. I refer to the sandwiching technique a lot in some of my other videos. And it's just a process of stacking cookies with a thick royal icing in between. So I want this dead center. I'm also going to glue this guy onto here while I've got it sitting here. Looking at it from top down to make sure it's nicely centered. Now normally I'd let all the black dots underneath dry completely before I do something like this, because if this were to fall off this little stand, I could smudge a dot. So it's a little precarious right now. I think that's a little too low, but based on my experience doing the first box, I think that's a little too high. So I'm going to cheat it a little bit by taking a little bit of black fondant, and I'm just going to take a little bit just so we don't see it when we look from the side. Dark color is good for this, and just going to use a little bit as a support. And the beauty of this is that it's still soft, so if I don't like the height, I can just press this into it a little bit more and make it a little bit shorter, and then just glue it on down, front, face, and forward, making sure it's nicely centered. I like the height of that from here, and I'm just going to get up and look at it from the top and make sure that it's nice and centered from a top-down view. And there you have it, little lid with a knobby top. Now you'd want this to dry overnight before setting it up on the other box. I should note though that you never would be lifting really by this knob. It's purely decorative. It's not going to have enough heft to it and strength of glue to support the weight of the lid underneath. So whenever I put this on the box, I lift from the bottom and gently place like so. Till next video, live sweetly. I've got another great 3D cookie project coming up for you.